All right, so I called today's talk Fear in God. And the reason being that I'm going to talk about fear and anxiety and why that provokes people to be religious, why that encourages people to be religious, what the consequences are, how religion helps people to feel less anxious, and what the implications are for us as humanists as we strive to build a less religious society, I would say. All right, so to kick it off, I'm going to talk about death and dying, because this is really, for many people, this is the most anxiety-inducing event that they can think of. All right, so the question I would have is, do many people here spend much time thinking about death and dying? Or I'm guessing most people, you don't. So the interesting quote here I have from a guy called Paul Woolley, who runs the Theos think tank, or pressure group. From about 2009, he was quoted as saying that he wants everybody to think more about death and dying, and he thinks that we would be a happier society if we all spent more time thinking about death, which struck me as a very strange thing to want us all to do. And one of the reasons I think that Paul Woolley is so interested in having everybody think more about death and dying is because it has effects on our thought processes and our religious beliefs. So the reason I think that is because there's quite a lot of research done into subliminal prompts. And by that I mean, if you've ever seen Derren Brown, you'll know what I'm talking about here. Derren Brown portrays himself as a mind reader. He can tell your thoughts, he knows what you're thinking. In fact, he readily admits that he's not a mind reader at all, and he uses various psychological tricks to do what he does in stage show. So, for instance, one of the things he does quite a lot of is he will put, at the beginning of his show, he'll put things up in the periphery of your vision to get you thinking in certain ways. And so later on in the show, he can tell you what you're going to say. It's not that he's reading your mind, it's more that he's controlling your mind because of what he's done earlier on in the show. Psychologists are very well aware of this trick, and they use it quite a lot, they study it quite a lot. So for instance, one thing they do, there's quite a lot of studies into what they call death primes. So they'll, at the beginning of the study, they'll get you to start thinking about death, often quite in a subconscious way, or they'll just ask you to write about death. And then later on in the study, they'll do some other things so that you're not quite sure what the study is about. But then later on in the study, they'll ask you some questions about what your beliefs are. And the interesting thing is, if you do this, and then ask people how religious they are, you get this kind of pattern here. So the green there is the group of people who haven't been asked to think about death. The blue one is the group of people who have been asked to think about death. Now when you ask them later on how religious they are, or whether they believe in God, they start off the same, but the people who've been asked to think about death, later on, they will tell you that they are more religious, and they have a stronger belief in God. There's clearly something very odd going on here. So what I'm going to do today, in my talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about why reminding people of death makes them more religious. I'm going to talk about some of the other things that link fear and superstition with religion. I'm going to talk a little bit about why some societies are more religious than others, and whether that's linked to fear and anxiety. And finally, I'm going to finish off by talking to you about whether religion actually does help to ease fear and anxiety. Okay. So, why should death primes, reminding people of death, why should it make people religious? Well, there's a couple of ideas on this. One is that when you remind people that they're going to die, they think, oh my goodness me, I don't want to go to hell, I want to go to heaven, so I better be more religious because that will get me a ticket into heaven. And that's possible, but there's also the idea that reminding people of death just makes them anxious. And it's that anxiety that makes them more religious. After all, we know that when you, it's quite an old idea that in the face of uncertainty, people will turn to superstition. So there's a classic study by a guy called Malinowski. He was a very, very famous anthropologist. In 1914, he was stuck in Australia, actually. He was in Australia, the war broke out. Malinowski is Polish, but was an Austrian national. So he couldn't go back to Europe. So he had to spend the war out in the Australasian region. Australian government said, well, you know, that's fine, you can travel around, we don't mind. And so he took the opportunity, he went to the place called the Trobriand Islands. And there he is, that's a picture of him with some Trobriand Islanders. And among the things that he noticed there, he saw the Trobriand Islanders, they had two choices when they went out fishing. They could go fishing in the lagoon, or they could take their boats and head out into the open sea. Now in the lagoon, they were very safe, and they'd get a reasonable catch of fish. If they went out on the open sea, they could get a really big haul of fish, but might all drown. So it was a dangerous thing to do, go in the open sea. And he noticed that though when they were going on fishing in the lagoon, they just went out and did it. But before going out to fish in the open sea, they went through all sorts of magical rituals and superstitious rituals. So this was the real first anthropological evidence that there was a difference, that it was uncertainty and fear. People used superstition as a way to overcome that, or to deal with that. Now the other interesting thing is another really interesting study. Okay, so if you think about government and religion, one idea that the researchers have had is that if religion offers a kind of security blanket, then maybe government also does. People like to think that the government looks after them. Most people have a bit of a love-hate relationship with the government. And so what they did, they wanted to know whether the two could substitute for each other. And to test this, what they did, this is a very interesting study, they got a group of students, and they gave half the students, well, they gave all the students this article, which is supposed to be about a scientific study. All right, it was a completely fake article, but that's what they told them. There was a genuine article. And there were two versions of this article. One version of this article said that scientists have proven that God is in control, and God tinkers with the universe and has control over the universe. In the other article, they said there's no God. All right, so they're giving students two different ideas about what scientists have decided about God. Okay, so here's the article. If you're wondering quite how they did this, so this is the end paragraphs of those articles. So in this one here, they said this is the one where they're telling the students that scientists have decided that God doesn't have any, doesn't interfere with the universe. So theoretical physicists have wondered for years why the world functions according to mathematics. Now it appears we know the answer. It was designed that way. A recent paper out of the prestigious scientific journal Nature argues that the fundamental laws of physics cannot change. Okay? The other half of the students got this version of the article, which is pretty much the same, but it ends by saying God is fudging the numbers, God is meddling in the universe. So some of the students thought scientific evidence that God is interfering with the universe. So then they asked them, then they asked them what their opinion of government was, whether they wanted a strong government or a weak government. So the interesting thing here, look at the left-hand side here. So the people who are told that God is interfering in the universe were less supportive of the government than people who are told that God doesn't meddle in the universe. So this is evidence that people want to feel that somebody is in control. And that if they feel if they feel God is in control, they don't want the government to be in control. If they don't feel that God is in control, they want government to be in control. So here's another thing to think about. So this is about if anxiety is a cause of religion, then can you take away the desire for religion with a pill? So this is quite a complicated study, but I'll try and talk you through it. What they did with this study is they got their students and they gave them a pill. And they told them this study was about colour perception. They wanted to see if this herbal pill, they told them, affects colour perception. All a big lie. And they told half of the students that the pill would also make them more anxious. It was all a complete lie. This was just a sugar pill, all right? All they were doing, they're giving them a sugar pill, and some of them thought that sugar pill would make them more anxious. So some of them were prepared to feel anxious, all right? And then And then they also divided them up into groups again and made some of them genuinely feel anxious with this other, by making them random thoughts. And the bottom line of this study is, I'm not going to dwell too much on this study because it is a little bit complicated. The bottom line on this study here is that this group here, when they were made to feel anxious, but they didn't know why they felt anxious, this was the group that became more religious. So if you make people anxious, and they can't understand why they're feeling anxious, they become religious. All right? So what I'm doing here is I'm just going over, there's a lot of research into linking anxiety and religion. Okay? When people are faced with a capricious world, they turn to religion. And you might think that's, and partly that's because they want to feel that God is in control, that makes them feel more secure. But it's actually more complicated than that. Here's another study. They made some people, two groups of students, made one group of students feel anxious, another group of students, they just left them as normal. The ones made to feel anxious actually rejected evolution, which is a very strange thing. If you're wondering why so many people around the world, especially the US, reject evolution, it's not simply about talking through the science with them. If people feel anxious, they reject the scientific theories of evolution. And I mean, there's the death primes, making people think about death, have an awful lot of other effects besides the effects on religion. It makes them hate foreigners and makes them vote right-wing, pass harsher sentences, even makes them prefer Marmite over other brands. All right, so I mean, the point is here that one of the reasons that people swing to religion, they like to feel that God is in control. That helps them feel less anxious. But they also, whenever you make people feel anxious, they always go to the things they're familiar with. So, Marmite, okay? Not liking foreigners, sticking with your own kind, okay? So part of the reason people become or go towards religion when they're made to feel anxious or unhappy is because they feel comfortable with religion, all right? You're probably wondering, all this talk about reminding people of death and making them more religious, that doesn't apply to me. Yes, hello.
I'm sorry to interrupt,
yeah.
But I'm not with you about what you mean by the word primes.
Oh, sorry, so this comes back to the Derren Brown thing I was saying earlier. So what you do with a prime is you subconsciously implant an idea in somebody's mind. So if you, so one of the things they'll do to do this is they'll make them do a quiz, a word quiz. And they'll have two groups of people, and in one group of people, all of the words in their quiz have to do with death and dying. In the other group, there'll just be other innocuous words. And so you've got two groups now. One, they've been made to think about death and dying, and the other group, they haven't. And what I'm saying is that when you do this, when you just make people think about death and dying, it changes their behaviour and makes them more religious, makes them believe in the supernatural.
Thank you.
Okay. And so the point about this slide is that what happens with atheists, they don't become more religious when you talk about death and dying. In fact, the opposite happens. What happens with atheists is that atheists have to become less religious and reject religion more. And the reason for that is that it all comes back to how you feel more comfortable as atheists. A lot of atheists define themselves as being not religious, and that's what makes them feel comfortable. And so they actually become less religious when you remind atheists of death and dying. Okay?
That's very reassuring.
Well, it is. So that's a tick mark for atheists. But, can't feel smug just yet, because this is the same researcher. So in this study, he asked people what they felt, okay? And the atheist said, I am less, after they've been primed with death primes, they said, I am even less religious than I was before. So in this study, what he asked them to do is to classify objects. There's natural objects over here, helicopter, turtle, things like that. There's imaginary objects, Batmobile, mermaids, okay? And there's things in the middle, like angels and the devil, okay? So the question is, how easy is it to classify these different kinds of objects, okay? So the atheists They found it very easy. When asked to say, to classify these objects, they found it very, so these ones are clearly real. God and angel and all that, clearly imaginary. And these things are also imaginary. Christians, on the other hand, would say, okay, so these are real, the turtle and the helicopter are real. God and angels, they're also real. So that's how Christians think, okay? When you gave atheists a death problem and made them think about death, made them more anxious, they actually found it much more hard to classify God and angels as being imaginary, okay? They were slower to do it. They did it, but they were slower to do it. They had to puzzle over it. So what this is saying is there is something very, very deep inside our heads which kind of makes us want to believe, even though as rational human beings we reject it and we feel comfortable rejecting it, there's something that works at quite a deep level to make people feel an urge to believe in something, even atheists. All right, so some other psychological links between fear and anxiety and superstition. To show this one, to illustrate this one, I'm going to show you a picture of a washing machine. All right, and you have to tell me what you can see. All right, so there's my washing machine. So the question is, do you see a washing machine? You probably don't. You probably see a face. And the reason for that is, hopefully you can see a face. Maybe it's just me. No? No? That's because you're a bunch of atheists. What about this one then? Yeah?
Oh yes.
All right. So this is the Easter Island milk carton. Sorry. Yeah.
You face crowders.
Ah, well, yeah. That's true. That's true. But I mean, okay. So the point is, well, what about this one then? The thing is, as human beings, we're driven to try and find patterns. We're driven to try and see things. We're driven to try and make sense of the world around us. And we're so powerfully driven to do that, because if you made a mistake, if you were in the jungle and you heard a noise, and it might be a lion, it might not be a lion, if you thought, well, sorry, it's probably not a lion, there's a chance you might get eaten, right? So we're always driven to see things and to try and make sense of the world around us and try and anticipate. So and that leads us to make mistakes. You know,
It makes more sense as a tree.
it makes more sense as a tree, but that's because you look at it, but your instantaneous reaction is that is there something there? And then of course you look at it, there isn't? No? Okay. All right. A lot of people, not everybody, this just goes to show that there's diversity in the population. So, you know, there is diversity. But we are pattern-seeking animals. We do try to find patterns and see patterns in the world around us. All right, and the point is that when you make people anxious, they become even more driven to find those patterns. And here's this study where they played a prank on some students, basically. They gave them this game to play, it was a pattern matching game, and the computer would flash up symbols, and you've got to try and guess what symbol goes with it. And, you know, you get it wrong, and then the computer would tell you what the right answer is, and you go through several iterations, and you learn the rules behind the game. All right, so this is game, a pattern matching game you play with the computer. What they did is they got some students to play with, but for half the students, the computer spat out gibberish. There was no pattern to understand. There was nothing to discern. All right? And so that made them feel like they didn't know what the hell was going on. It made them feel like the world was not really making sense. Okay? So that made them a little bit, oh my goodness me, I'm not seeing what's going on here. Okay? And then they showed them some pictures. These are some of the pictures they showed them. And if you can see, in some of them, it looks like, if you look hard, I mean, there's probably a tent or something in there. Maybe there's a boat in that one, a horse in that one. So some of them, there's something going on there. But for some of the pictures, like that one in the top middle there, there's nothing there, it's just random noise. So the question is, what they did is they showed them all these pictures and said, write down what you see. Now the interesting thing was, for the students who'd been made to feel anxious, like they couldn't see the pattern because there was no pattern, but they didn't know that, they were just feeling anxious, they were much more likely to say they could see something in this random noise than students who weren't feeling anxious. All right? So the more anxious you are, the more you feel like the world is not making sense, the harder your brain works to see patterns, even when they're not there. And the point about this is that people often say they see God's hand. They can see things that are, you know, things make sense because God is making them sense. That's because it's part of the response to being anxious and upset. All right? So we try to recognise patterns. When we're faced with an uncertain world, we're really driven to try and see patterns. And this one is, it's not really relevant actually directly to what I'm talking about, but it's just a nice one. If you've ever read Kafka, I don't know how many people have ever read a novel by Kafka, but he's a really, really weird writer, okay? He has, stuff he writes about doesn't make sense at all quite often. And the point is that there was another study done where they gave them some Kafka to read, and the sheer unsettling nature of reading Kafka actually also drives you to try and find patterns even more. So that's a really strange thing. Next time you're reading Kafka, beware, because it's having quite a deep effect on the way your mind works. Okay, so just more evidence on how people try to find meaning and sense through God in certain circumstances, but not others. So they asked a bunch of Christians. They gave them this little story. There was a family having a picnic in a valley, and a dam at the top of the valley burst, and all the water cascaded out. So who do you think was God responsible for this? And the point is that here, that if they were told that an evil dam worker had caused the dam to burst, then they didn't think God was responsible. I mean, they could have said yes. They could have said God made the evil dam worker burst the dam, but they didn't. If they were told nobody caused it to happen, but nobody was hurt, they still didn't say that God was responsible. They only said that God was responsible if the family was killed, which is a really strange thing, don't you think? Because God is supposed to be a good God. But if the family was killed, they said that God was responsible, but not in any of the other circumstances. Okay? The reason for this is that when the family is killed, that's a moral outcome. There's something bad happened here, and they've got to make sense of it. And the only way they can make sense of it is to say that God is working in mysterious ways. Right? So people turn to God to try and make sense of tragedy and upsetting things. You probably all know that already, but here's the scientific studies to show that. Castaway film. Right? So what happens in Castaway? Tom Hanks, stuck on an island, Robinson Crusoe style. One of the things he does is that one day he cuts his hand, and his bloody handprint on the ball there makes something that reminds him of a face. And through the film, what basically happens as the film progresses is he develops a relationship with this face on a ball, and it becomes his friend, he talks to it and all this sort of stuff. So the question is that a bit of poetic license, or is it real? Does this really happen? So what this guy Nicholas Epley did was that he sat people down to watch 3 different films. He got some people to watch the film Castaway. The idea was that would make them think about lonely stuff, make them feel lonely. Got some of them to watch The Silence of the Lambs. That's a scary film, make them feel frightened. Major League, which is a comedy film, to make them feel happy and alive. So which one of these 3 groups of students then, which one was the most religious after this? Okay, and what happened, what it was, basically, the people who'd been asked to watch Castaway actually then reported being more religious. So if you're made to feel lonely, you also become more religious. So in this one, this is another similar sort of study. They got these poor students, right? And they had to fill out this quiz, this computerized thing. And what the idea was is you put in all your personal information, and this very, very clever computer would spit out an answer to say what your future life would be like. All right? And again, it was a complete fudge, and the computer wasn't doing anything. Half the students, they gave this thing that said, I'm really sorry, you're going to be very lonely in later life. The computer says that you're going to be really lonely in later life. And simply doing that, simply telling them that a computer had said they were going to be lonely in later life, also made them more religious. Not only did it make them more religious, it actually made them attribute personalities to household items, so like the kettle. They'd be more likely to say the kettle has a personality if you told them they were going to be lonely in later life. Okay, so people project what they want into the world around them. Okay, so summarising this bit, there are lots of reasons why making people frightened and anxious and uncertain makes them turn to God. I mean, it helps them, they like to feel that somebody is in control. We all have a barometer about, how anxious we are happy to be. A little bit of anxiety is good, a little bit of not feeling in control is good. When it goes too far, people try and rein it in by making sense of the world, and one of the ways they do that is to make them feel that God is in control. when they're threatened, everybody returns to their core cultural values. So for religious people, that's going to be part of the Christian church or whatever. And also, when things are uncertain, we're driven to find patterns and purpose. So there's and really, to summarise this part of the talk, probably most of us already understood that when people feel frightened or scared, they turn to God. But there's now a lot of scientific evidence to show this really is true, that this really does have quite deep-seated psychological basis. All right. So now, coming back to some of does this help to explain why some societies are more religious than others? And the short answer is yes. But the point here is that even we encounter fearful scenarios in every part of our daily life. And here's a man who's frightened of basketballs, it looks like. All right. So, but there's actually a lot of research that the more dangerous your environment is, the more scary the place that you live, the more likely you are to be. The more likely you are to be religious. So here's a study that's based on every year or two. There's this big survey that's conducted throughout Europe, and they ask people in a whole bunch of different countries all sorts of different things. One of the things they ask them is about how religious they are. And when you can control for, and you take into account differences in age and how religious each individual country are, you look at individual people, and throughout Europe, people who are in good health, in stable employment, who are well educated, and are not experienced war or the threat of terrorism, they are the least religious people. So one of the reasons why there's not so many religious people in the UK, and one of the reasons why in Scandinavia are the least religious countries in the world, because it's all this security going on here. And then, so you look across, this is something else. So they do this, there's a survey called the Global Peace Index, which measures how dangerous countries are based on how many murders there are, how much they spend on their army and all that sort of stuff. And if you look at the most peaceful countries, the ones that score the best on the Peace Index, they have the most atheists as well. And the fewest people going to church. Okay? So, better countries, more atheists. This is trust. There's a lot of scatter here, but basically it's a statistically significant. This is a real trend here. Looking across the world, the most trusting nations are the least religious. Okay, where you have a lot of where people trust each other. There's not so many religious people. That's Sweden, Norway, Denmark up there. I don't know where the UK is. Oh, there's the UK, just sort of there. So we're okay. We don't really trust people, but we're still not very religious. And down here are all the African countries where you can't trust anybody. These poor countries, really. Okay. Social capital. So what social capital is all about. It's about organisation. So you coming here today, attending a group, that's part of all the small social interactions that make up society, make a society stronger. So trades unions, interest groups, hobbyist groups, all those sorts of little groups, choral singing, my mum's in a choral singing group. So all those small things, they're all part of social capital. And what this graph is showing is how rich different countries are in social capital. And you look again up here, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Netherlands, are all very high in social capital, and they're all not very religious. And down here again, so that's Portugal.
What do you mean by social capital?
Yeah, so social capital is well, there's two different kinds of social capital written here. So private social capital. So this is about joining groups to. The bottom line about social capital is about groups. It's about all the small human interactions that lubricate society and help society to work, that bring people together in different ways. So that's what I'm saying. So this group here, this humanist group that we're in today, that's part of social capital. That's counted towards social capital. We're all here in a group, we're sharing things, we're coming together for whatever reason. Any other groups that people do, hobby groups, trade union groups, political parties, even religious services were counted in this. So all those kinds of interactions. And the point is that the societies that are stronger and healthier and happier tend to have lots of these little small interactions. Okay, and so these Scandinavian countries are they function very well. And part of the reason they function very well is because they have so many of these small human interactions, and they're also not very religious. And the point about this is that all of these interactions help us feel more comfortable and more happy in our lives. And when you look around the world, statistically, I mean, as humanists, you probably would recognise this picture anyway, but when you tell religious people this, they can't quite believe it. They think there's something wrong with the statistics. It's been shown time and time again. The more religious the country is, the higher the infant mortality, more murders, more corruption, more AIDS, and even higher abortions. Okay, there's more abortions. The more religious your country is, the more abortion is outlawed, the more abortions there actually are. All right? So the best way to reduce abortions is to get rid of religion. And this is another one, this is the final one, just to really ram home the point, this is quality of life. This is what they did, these researchers, they came up with an objective measure of how good life is, and they did it in quite a complicated way, which I won't go into here, but all these factors on the left there is what went into the mix. And the bottom line here is, again, they found the countries with the highest quality of life were the least religious. Okay, so atheist countries are the good places to live, religious countries are the worst places to live. So the question is, what's going on here? Is this explaining why these countries are actually more religious? So there's a bit of background. There's actually, conventionally there are two theories about why some countries are more religious than others. One is that the idea that modernization will blow away religion. Okay, so as we become wealthier and better educated, people will give up religion, the old Enlightenment argument, all right? So the Enlightenment was 200 years ago, we've still got a lot of religion around, so you might want, that's the first flag to make you think that maybe the story is not that simple. The other thing is, why is the USA so religious? They've got good education, fairly good education, and they're very wealthy. Still a very religious nation. So what American sociologists reckon is that it's nothing to do with wealth and better education, that religion is in fact the pinnacle of society, and the best educated societies will actually be the most religious. And what they say is it's all down to religious markets. Because if you have a free market in religion, they say, religion, different kinds of religions will compete until the best religion comes out, and it'll be so attractive that people will want to be religious all the time. So that's their kind of free market argument. And basically the modernization theory is the European argument. They say, and the Americans say, the reasons the Europeans are not religious is because we have all these state churches and people are compelled to follow particular religions, and that makes people hate religion, etc., etc. Both these stories have some elements of truth, but they're clearly not the full picture. So, coming back to, I mean, I did some research. This was actually following on from some earlier research done by some Pippa Norris and Ron Inglehart into income inequality. And the interesting thing about income inequality is that when you look around the world, again, this is another factor. The most unequal countries in terms of income are also the least religious, most religious. More inequality, more religion. And the thing about income inequality is it actually correlates with all sorts of other things, bad things like murder rates and life expectancy and stuff like that. So what I was interested to see is whether this was an additional factor, in addition to wealth and all the other things we've talked about, in explaining why some countries were more religious than others. So I created this model, mathematical model, threw all the statistics in, and I found that you could explain a lot of religion in terms of, so these two here, religious regulation, religious, this is about the markets theory, the American theory, okay? And it really does turn out that the less you regulate religion, the more you open up religion, if you get rid of the state church, if you get the bishops out of the House of Lords, if you take the state out of religion, it's really true. Countries do become more religious if you open up religion as a free market. Okay? What's also true, the more urbanised a country, the less religious it is, and that's probably because when you have an urbanised country, it's very easy for people to form groups and to form other kinds of societies and groupings, and rural people are just more religious for whatever reason. Wealth is also important. You know, the wealthier the country, the less religious it is. So all of these theories are actually true, all those ones I was just talking about, but also income inequality seems to be an independent, another factor, all right? So and the point about this is not necessarily that income inequality makes people religious, but what it is that it's not simply about how wealthy a nation is, it's also about how that wealth is distributed. If you've got a lot of people, poor people and rich people, and even if the average is high, there's still going to be a lot of distress. The point is the income inequality is a marker of things going wrong in a society. Highly unequal societies tend to have a lot of other things wrong with them. Okay, so it's not just about wealth, it's also about how you share out that wealth. Okay, and this is just how the model worked out. So this is the thing I published back in 2009, and it predicts. So this is how religion is, how much religion you would expect a country to have, how much you would expect them to pray, based on all of those factors, and yeah, it's a fairly good relationship. So the model works quite well to help understand why some countries are more religious than others. And it's not just, and since then there have been quite a few other studies, it's not just mine. So this is one by Frank van Toobergen, found pretty much the same thing, but looking at religious church service attendance. All right, so what he found was that what affects church attendance, looking across a bunch of European countries, so religious regulation again. Okay, so that was quite important. The more you regulate religion, the less people want to go to church. If they feel like going to church is kind of you're compelled to do it by the state, they don't want to do it. Religious culture, so that means that if your parents are religious, then you will be more likely to go to church. And the one here is income inequality again. So there's actually been quite a lot of research, other research done into this. And I just want to re-emphasize, it's not that income inequality directly causes religion, it's just that it's a marker for things going wrong in society. So just to sum up this section, there's a lot of evidence that worse societies are more religious, and that a lot of people, that's quite surprising, but it really is true, and it's true whether you look across the whole world or whether you just look at rich countries or anything. You know, whichever group of countries you look at, it's a fairly safe bet that the best places to live will have the fewest religious people. Now, it's possible that religion makes societies worse, but I think what's really going on here, the most important factor is that when things are tough, people turn to religion, for all the reasons that I discussed in the beginning of the talk. Okay? And this applies even to wealthy countries like the USA, because there's a lot of insecurity in the USA. There's no welfare, state welfare. There's not so much state welfare. You know, if things go bad, you're on your own in the US, and so that makes you more anxious. People turn to religious, and that's why the USA is so religious compared with European countries. All right. So now the $64,000 question: does religion actually help to reduce the levels of anxiety? If we all became more religious, we'd all be more chilled out and more happy. The answer is yes, but. All right. So I'm going to talk to you about the uh-oh moment. All right. So this is a brain. This is a brain. So there's a little piece here in the brain where if you strap electrodes to somebody's head and record, you can actually get a recording of what goes on in this little part of the brain. And for people who are familiar with neuroanatomy, this bit here is called the limbic cortex. It's a very primitive part of the brain. It's kind of a bit which we kind of share with our reptilian cousins, I guess I should say. So and this part of the brain is really involved with all our primal sort of emotions and a bit of memory stuff and kind of really deep-seated stuff, not our higher level thought processes. So if you measure what goes on in this little tiny bit of the brain here, you can actually, when people make a mistake, you can actually see it. It goes blip, a little blip, right? And what this seems to be linked to is that when you make a mistake and you feel, you know, that I'm kicking myself mentally, right? That sensation seems to be linked generated, or at least this little bit here plays a role in that, okay? So what they did, they sat down a bunch of students, again, it's always students, this is a study done in Canada, and they said, okay, they ran this test to try and make them make mistakes while they were strapped in with electrodes and what have you. So they did this is called the Stroop colour word test. And it works like this. So you have to say what colour the letters are. Alright, so it's fairly easy. The letters here are blue. Alright? And it's fairly easy, the letters are green. Alright? What colour are the letters? Well, the letters are green, but people say blue. Alright? And then and as soon as you say it, you go, oh, damn. Alright? And so this is the study they did to make people make a mistake, and everybody makes mistakes on this one. You're under time pressure, you have to bubble. So, and look what happens. So here on the left, we've got the atheists, all right? So the purple line, this is when they get it right. There's nothing, or even a little bit negative. But when they get it wrong, they go, that uh-oh moment, right? Here's the religious people on the right. They make a mistake, it's the same as for atheists. I mean, they get it right, it's the same for atheists, but they make a mistake, hardly a blip. Alright? And the interesting thing is this is the same sort of thing that happens if you give somebody an anxiolytic drug like Xanax, these things that take away your worries. Alright? It has a similar effect on this little tiny bit of the brain. And they've done some other research, again, priming studies. If you prime people with the idea of religion and God, it works for Christians, it doesn't work for atheists, I'm afraid. It actually has a really strong effect at taking away anxiety. They don't worry so much. So it actually, Mark said that religion was an opiate. Not an opiate, but an anxiolytic. It really is true. Blood pressure. Okay, so what they did in this study is they got a bunch of people, they made them do a mock job interview. And to really pile on the pressure, they said it was going to be filmed. So they filmed these people making their case that they should be employed. And it's quite a stressful thing to force people to do. And you can see when they just made people do it, their blood pressure went up quite a lot. All right. But if before doing the filming, they got them to say a little prayer, no increase in blood pressure. Now the point is here is the self-talk thing. So this was not praying. This was just, I am good. They had a little script to read about how confident they were in themselves. The point is, prayer can take away this anxiety response. There are other ways of doing it. There's nothing magical about prayer. It's not as if God is coming and actually doing something. There are other ways to take away the anxiety, but prayer is one of them. Prayer really does work as a way to make people less stressed. It works outside the lab as well. People who go to church more often have lower blood pressure on average. Okay? I don't know whether they have lower blood pressure than people who come to humanist groups, but they have lower blood pressure than the rest of the population. So I've just pulled this one out because it's the most recent study I've seen. So this was done in Norway. Most studies are done in the US. And the thing is about the US is that everybody goes to church. Normal people in the US go to church. Okay, so when you look at people who don't go to church in the US, you're always a little bit never quite sure because they tend to be quite unusual people. They're outsiders, loners. They're different people in the US. In Norway, nobody goes to church. Hardly anybody goes to church, right? And even in Norway, this is the study. It's in this little county here, and every 10 years or so, they measure all sorts of health outcomes in the group of people that live here. And the 4% of people, Norwegians who went to church regularly, had slightly lower blood pressure. Okay, so it even works for Norwegians. Okay. So one of the things that religion can also help you do is to resist temptation. So students primed with thoughts of God, so they made them think about God, and then they quizzed them, and they said, how good are you at resisting bad food that you shouldn't be eating? And they said, oh, I'm good. And they were more likely to say they were good at resisting unhealthy food. They were more likely to say that they were health conscious, all right, if you primed them with thoughts of God. And they were more likely to have subconscious negative reactions to junk food. And that's all well and good. What they actually found is, so they did the study, they primed them with thoughts of God, they asked them these questions. And they said, the study's over, out you go. And just outside we've got some biscuits for you to eat. if they'd been primed with thoughts of God, they actually ate fewer biscuits when they left. Okay? So God helps you to resist temptation. But same students, the same study, they don't work as hard to achieve their goals. When they're primed with thoughts of God, they didn't work as hard on a test. They're given a test and said, the outcome of this test will have implications for how well you do in your career. They didn't work as hard if they'd been primed with thoughts of God. All right? They were less interested in doing some additional work to become whatever it is they wanted to be. And that wasn't because they didn't want, they renounced the material world or whatever, and nonsense like that. It wasn't that at all. They still wanted to be the lawyer, the hotshot lawyer, the stockbroker, all that sort of thing. They still wanted that. They just weren't as inclined to work. Probably because if you're taking an anxiolytic, you're not that fun. You know, God is in control. God is going to sort things out. So that's the downside. We need a little bit of anxiety in our life. It's good for you. It's good for you to drive you to do things. Never say die. So, religious people, coming back to what I was talking about at the beginning, about death and dying, religious people are more likely, when they're at death's door, the doctor says, you know, we've got this treatment we can give you, it almost certainly won't work, it's going to be painful, it's going to be quite distressing, do you want to go for it? Religious people are more likely to say, yes, I would like that. The reason, and this is a study they've done, the reason the religious people are more likely to want these things is because they're over-optimistic about how likely they are to live. And that's because they think God's going to save them. You know, it doesn't happen, but that's what they think. And this is a real problem because, I mean, it's actually quite distressing for the patients and for the relatives. They also are less likely to make living wills, and they're less likely to nominate a healthcare proxy. So basically, because they're not so worried about things, because they think God is going to take care of everything, it has real life consequences that can be assessed in these studies. Other studies have shown that they looked at, in the Netherlands, they split the Netherlands up into small little counties, and wherever you have more of it, they have these particular very, very orthodox Protestant sects, and wherever you have more of these highly orthodox Protestants, vaccination rates are lower. Again, because health is in God's hand. More likely to have unprotected sex, Christians. So these are just some studies showing some real world consequences of the religious approach. So, less likely to practice safe sex, less likely to take their medicine. People don't take their medicine if they're highly religious because, again, they think, you know, God is going to be going to save me, or God is in charge here. So they, and this comes back to we were talking about that football player, I've forgotten his name again now, who had a heart attack on the pitch, and praying for him. Is it the prayer, or is it the paramedics who saved his life? Religious people will tell them to say it's the prayer. And if you think the prayer is going to save your life, then you don't really need the paramedics. Wrong, of course, but this is the problem. This is what happens. So this is the downside to helping you to feel comfortable, is that you make errors in your life. And this is about religious zealotry. So what happens here is that what they did is if you make people feel anxious, for those who are not empowered in life, they also become more zealous in their religion. So this comes through to the whole issue of, you know, religious suicide pacts and all that sort of stuff. Anxiety and religion are a very, very dangerous mix, and we all know that, of course. But here's a real life study where they made religious people feel more anxious, and then actually measured that made them more zealous in their religion. Right, cause and effect. So religious countries are worse places to live, but is that because religion makes the country worse, or is it because having a bad country makes you more religious? Coming back to the inequality thing, one of the reasons why religious countries are more unequal is because religious people like it that way. So this is a measure of different countries, and the darker the colour, the more unequal the countries are. And what they found is that people living in countries where it was highly unequal or religious people in general, don't want government to reduce inequalities. They don't want social welfare. And one of the reasons they don't want social welfare spending is they think God is going to look after them when they're made unemployed or when they get sick. So there's this active thing going on here where it could be a kind of a feedback loop. They don't want society to. They vote against government's welfare programs and such like, and that can make the country a worse place to live, and that makes more people more religious. Everybody thinks that if you're religious, then you'll be less worried about death. That's not true at all. Seems to work for Christians. This is a study done in Manchester. Seems to work for Christians. So here's people with no religion on the right. They got moderate levels of fear of death. Christians seem to be a little bit less. Muslims higher. The reason for this is that over the centuries, in recent centuries, and especially recent decades, Christianity has been kind of transformed. Christians don't talk about hell very much anymore. It's very unfashionable. No Christian thinks they're really going to go to hell. They don't worry about that sort of thing. Muslims, a very different picture. The idea of hell and punishment from God is very much alive for Muslims, and so they're quite worried when faced with the prospect of death, because they think there's a real chance that they're going to face eternal torture at the hands of their creator. So religion doesn't decrease anxiety about death, and why this is important. If you look at countries around, so this is, what they did is they measured how fearful people were in different countries in Europe, and this is the last slide. How fearful people were in countries around Europe, and you see, so some countries like down in Spain and Greece, and this was done in 2000, so well before all the economic collapse. And they asked things about how worried are you about avian flu, how worried are you about terrorism, how worried are you about all different things. And they found that people who are worried about one thing also tend to be worried about other things. Some people are just warriors, okay? So this is a measure of how many warriors, worried people there are in different countries. And some countries, people are just a lot more worried. And what they showed was, this correlates really well with how many people believe in hell. The more people believe in hell, the more worried they are about things in general. They don't just become frightened about death, they become frightened about everything. It seems that by talking about hell and pumping up those fear levels, you just generate a general feeling of fear and anxiety. And of course that makes people become more religious. And so there is this loop going on, where more religion means more fear and anxiety, and more and more religion. Okay, so just to come back to summarise what I've been talking about then. Why do people become more religious when they're reminded of death? Well, they turn to comforting beliefs that help them to feel more secure. Are there other psychological links between fear and superstition? Yeah, I mean, when people aren't in control of their surroundings, they try to make sense of things. And they invent imaginary friends. Some societies are more religious than others, and part of the reason for this is that they are more fearful and more worse places to live. And religion can indeed help to ease fear and anxiety, but at the cost of complacency. And so that's my brief summary of some of the research into why some people are more religious and why some countries in particular are more religious than others. That's the end.
Are you happy to take questions?
Yes, of course. Yeah, any questions? Yeah.
Right, Tom, thank you very much for that really fascinating talk. There's so much there. Not quite sure what to do with it, but anyway, let's have some questions right at the back there. I'll come and Angela first.
All right, firstly, just thank you. That's brilliant, and I've been scribbling the whole time, and I'm hoping I'll be able to read it afterwards. What I'd like to know, because you've quoted so many different studies, is who is financing, who is funding all this research, because it's really pretty sensitive politically and socially, and I'm interested in where the urge to get these results comes from.
Yeah, the simple answer to that is it's governments around the world. This is academics, this is professors in various universities around the world, and the thing is about the academic community, they're by and large atheists, and so they're quite happy to do this kind of research, and the people who control the funds mostly are atheists as well, and you know, so it's just part of the normal research. I mean, to be fair, this kind of hard-hitting research into religion is a fairly modern thing. It's only been going on for the past 10 or 15 years. But a lot of it takes place in the US. There's a lot more in Canada. Canada is one of the hot spots. New Zealand does some good research as well. Europe is a little way behind, but there's quite a lot of research in Europe as well. So all over the world, people are doing this kind of research because there's a lot of money in trying to understand religion, a lot of acceptance of the fact that you know, there's good things and bad things.
Thank you. I wanted to just come back to what you said about the United States, that if religion is so tied to anxiety, and that's because it's strong in America because society is so unequal, would you not expect those lower down to be much more religious than those higher up, who are very secure, they're doing terribly well in the richest country in the world, and yet there hasn't been a president that I can remember who didn't come out as highly religious. Obama was very busy doing it suddenly at his inauguration, and that seems very strange. Are they doing it just to be accepted, or do they actually mean it?
Right, so there's a lot of answers to that question. All right, so first off, yes, on the one hand, they have to be elected, so they have to appeal to all, so politicians, that's clearly the case. For rich people, well, one answer is that rich people in the US are less religious than poor people, surveys show that. The other thing to think about, that the middle classes in the US, although they're wealthy, they're not necessarily secure. You can go from being, if you lose your job, you might be quite well off, but then there's no social safety net, so you're screwed if you lose your job. So that's what I mean about income inequality, because if you're in a very equal country, then you haven't got that far to fall. Whereas in America, there's a long way down. And the other thing is, there's some other research that it didn't show, which is quite fascinating, is that what tends to happen is that in unequal countries, everybody, rich and poor, is more religious than in more equal countries. And that's because countries develop a kind of national culture. Everybody likes to fit in, everybody likes to have the same kinds of approach to things like religion as their neighbours. So there's a cultural thing going on here as well. It's not simply the pure direct effects, there's the creating of a culture of religion in unequal countries.
Who's next? More questions? No, we'll come to you.
Sorry, I could probably do just as well without this. Are the therapeutic sort of benefits that you mentioned towards the end of religion actually due to religion or due to the community effect of religion? Is it more the social interaction or the actual religious belief?
Okay, so it's hard to tell. Religious people tend to be healthier than non-religious people. They tend to live longer. But this is mostly or entirely explained by religious attendance, going to church. It's not about their beliefs, it's about whether they go to church or not. So which is coming back to the whole idea of social capital and being in groups, and exactly as you're saying. The critical thing is probably being in a group and being around friends and feeling like you're part of society and having that kind of social support. That's the critical thing. Any other effects of religion, they might be there, but in practical terms, it's hard to see. So maybe, but probably not significant.
On the basis that, this is my opinion, on the basis that religions are all power-based, really, if you're in a very religious country and you have any doubts about religion, you dare stick your head above the parapet because you'd be so ostracised and you'd get so much fire and brimstone from the pulpit, from the priest, who's got a very nice income thanks to the fact he's doing it, that surely it just prevents people from deviating from religion.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, and you actually there's some other research which shows very nicely that conventionally they've always psychologists have always said that religious people are more happy than non-religious people, and that's because they've always done their research in the USA. And in the USA, it's very true. Religious people are happier than non-religious people. But if you look in other parts of the world where there are not so many religious people around, then non-religious people are perfectly happy. All right? So, yeah, it is actually absolutely true that there's a lot of social pressure to conform. And in the US, well, it comes back to what I was saying, but in the USA, when you look at atheists in the USA, they're an unusual bunch of people because they're the people who are willing to stick their heads above the parapet. So the USA is where a lot of research is done, but it's not a very good model for other countries, certainly not for European countries, where you can be an atheist and you can still have good social standing usually.
You said about religious people, or the religious, prefer inequalities in society, and I think you said that because they expected that God was going to sort things out in society. Is that all there is to it, or is there something more?
Okay, there's not an awful lot of research into this, but there is research showing that religious people are less supportive of God in general. Religious people are less supportive of government in general. They don't want government welfare spending. They don't see it. If you ask religious people, is the government's job to reduce inequalities, they are more likely to say no than the non-religious people. And also, if you say, ask a religious person, in Europe at least, do you think the government should be providing welfare? They are more likely to say no. Now, the reason for this is complex, because the thing is, a major reason why people don't like welfare, don't like the idea of welfare, is they don't like their money. They don't mind their money going to somebody like them, but they don't want it going to foreign strangers, people who are not like them. All right. So if you're highly religious, and say I'm a Catholic in England, a lot of my tax money is going to go to welfare for Protestants, and you're not going to want that. Okay, so highly religious people also want to keep their money within their church so that they can give money to their fellow religious people directly and don't have it going to people from different groups. And it also works with ethnicities. We don't want our money, white people don't want their money to go to Asians, all that sort of stuff. So divided societies are a really good indicator. The more divided the society is, the less trusting a society is, the less people are in favour of welfare. So I don't know if that answers your question, or there is that?
Well, I was wondering, it was partly to do with the Protestant work ethic.
Okay. So the Protestant work ethic, and I nearly put a slide in about that, but I decided not to at the end. So, the Protestant work ethic there's been a lot of research into this. And people find a lot of different things about whether Protestants really do have a work ethic. It's clear that Protestant countries are richer than Catholic countries, and that people, there are a lot of other differences between Protestant and Catholic countries. In particular, Protestant countries are more trusting than Catholic countries. So is it about the work ethic? Certainly, there is no correlation between belief in the afterlife, even among Protestant countries. Belief in the afterlife does not make people give them a greater work ethic. If by work ethic you mean working without any reward in this world, you might think that if the Protestant work ethic was real, then people who believed in an afterlife would have a particularly strong work ethic. Okay? But when you look at people with a Protestant tradition who are religious but not really believers in the afterlife, there are quite a lot of them around, compare those with people who are Protestant but do believe in the afterlife, there's no difference in work ethic as far as anybody can work out. So there may be something to do with the Protestant work ethic, but I would not like to try to summarise that research because there's so much of it and it's contradictory, very contradictory.
Thank you for a very interesting talk this afternoon. Can you give us any reasons to be cheerful for the UK? Because the things that you've said suggest that with the current position sliding into inequality and anxiety, that we're going to become terribly religious.
No, sadly. I think that the UK is, I think there's a lot of research now showing that Europe as a whole has a more religious future than now. It's probably going to get, I mean, there's a lot of reasons for this, but Europe, if you look at birth rates, for instance, and conversion rates, and there's a guy called Gerald Kaufman at Berkeley College who's done a lot of research and is trying to work out where Europe, and in fact the whole world, is heading. And if you look in Europe about who has the most children, about who changes from one religion to another, or out from religion to atheism, or from atheism to religion, you crunch all these numbers through, and it's very clear the high watermark of atheism will probably come in about 10 or 20 years, and then it's downhill from there on. I think we face, for a number of reasons, we face a more religious future.
Oh, please, something more cheerful than that.
Well, you know, the other thing is, there is a trend, okay, so if you look at Scandinavian societies, they're very trusting societies. They have a lot of communal ethic. They're very well integrated. If there's one hope for atheism, I think it's not in trying to persuade people to be more scientific and be more rational, because, well, that's part of it. But at the end of the day, people are not terribly scientific and not very rational. None of us are particularly rational. If you want to make society less religious, we have to increase trust, we have to build up community groups and make people feel like they are with friends and have social support. That's the true way to make a less religious society. If you want to undermine or reduce the power of religion in society, that's the best way to do it, in my opinion.
We'll all move to Norway.
Sounds like a big society.
Well, yeah, I mean, big society, absolutely. I mean, that, if it truly works to create social capital, and I mean, when I talk about social capital, when they talk about this big society, that's what they're trying to say. They're trying to say they want to build up social capital, and I think, yeah, absolutely, that's a positive thing to do. It depends, you know, people have criticism about how you actually go about doing that, but I think that's definitely what we need to do.
Thank you. To a certain extent, of course, we're undermined by the religious leaders who persist in saying that things are true when they are not, because they haven't got evidence. So perhaps there's just some possibility that the religious leaders will say, well, we were all wrong for all these thousands of years, it's okay, be atheist, but...
I read an interesting study actually quite recently dealing with, I think it might have been Denmark or it might have been the Netherlands, and it was basically research into the psychological problems and difficulties of being a priest or a pastor or a religious leader and not believing in God. And it's quite a difficult thing to do apparently, but there's a lot of them. There's a lot of them out there, and they face this problem because they understand that there is a need for religion, or not necessarily religion, but the religious groupings, and they want that community thing, and they like all that aspects of their job, but they just can't believe in God, and they've got to try and reconcile them to it. It's not easy for them.
Yeah, there was a YouTube about it, I saw the links and I went to it, and it was quite interesting. This pastor, was it on the news recently?
Any more questions? Yes, okay.
Are there any links between religious belief and the ability to plan for the future?
The ability to plan for the future. I think that, no, people... okay, so the one thing I would say is that planning for the future makes people unhappy. All right? When you ask people to think about the future and work out what's going to happen in the future, it makes them anxious. And there's some studies showing that they then become, if you ask people to think about the future, they then become hostile to immigrants, to foreigners, and all this sort of stuff, right? So I would suspect that the more you think about the future, maybe the more religious you would be inclined to become for the same reasons, because it kind of is a way of dealing with the future. I don't know whether religious people do not plan for the future as well. There's evidence that they do quite well at managing their finances, for instance, so they don't get into debt particularly. I mean, there's evidence here that they don't vaccinate their children, so arguably they're not planning for that particular future, but maybe they are planning for their future, so they think the future's all right. So it depends what you mean by planning for the future. I think they can think into the future, it's just the plans they make are different.
Tom, many thanks. Tom is a founder member of Humanists for Science, of which I'm the chair. He does some excellent work analysing why people are religious. If you are interested in it, he does about once a week, I would say, he summarises a piece of work on his blog, and that is Epiphenomena. So if you Google that, you'll find it. I would recommend it, just to dip into. His reports typically, there you go, Epiphenomena. Epiphenom, I'm sorry. I always get that wrong. His reports are characterised by, they're snappy, they typically are a paragraph or maybe 2 or 3, and they always have a graph, and they are extremely, I find, very easy to understand, so I would definitely recommend. And also, as I said, Tom is a member of Humanists for Science, and if you Google that, you'll find other people of like mind.
Thanks, Chris. We've got time for, 2 more questions, and then we'll stop for the tea break. So, Dennis and then Dave, and then we'll stop for tea.
Well, thanks for an excellent talk. Now, a bit of alarm. It seemed to imply that it's not a good idea to disestablish the church from the state. That getting the bishops out of the House of Lords, for instance. Could you comment on that?
Right. One of the best ways to undermine the credibility of religion is to put religious people in a position of power. If you put bishops in the House of Lords, then it undermines it. As soon as you try and compel people to believe in the God that they're supposed to believe in, they start rejecting religion. Right. So I think I'm agnostic about bishops in the House of Lords. I think that I can see it's an anachronism and stupid, and what on earth are they doing there. On the other hand, they probably encourage people to think that religion's a load of codswallop. So,
There's a challenge for us. Just a bit of change about this.
Hi Tom, this is probably slightly off topic, but why have you chosen this particular name for your website? Because I thought this was related to a strange belief in sort of between dualism and monism sort of thing, where the brain is sort of, well, you can probably explain it better than I am if I've got the right idea.
Okay, so an epiphenomenon is something that is a byproduct of some other process, basically. So for instance, some people argue that our minds are an epiphenomenon. Our brains are away doing all the stuff that they do, and our minds are just something that comes along for the ride, and we think that we're in control, but we aren't really. I called it epiphenomenon. I like the idea. That's basically why I called it this, and I think that, and also, in a way, I mean, other people are doing the research, and I'm writing about it. So what the blog is an epiphenomenon of research into psychology and sociology. So, yeah, and also people can find it when they Google it. That's basically the main reason.
Tom, I have one final question for you. Does alcohol reduce or increase anxiety?
Well, it reduces fear. So remember the survey which I showed where they had the map of the fear in different countries around the world? All right, so if you ask people how fearful they are, they're more fearful in the morning than in the evenings. And the reason for this, the researchers surmise, is by the time it's come to the evening, they've had a glass or two. So, so they're less fearful. There you go.
Well, on that